God, thank you so very much for all the good blessings that you give us. We are thankful for Jesus. We're thankful that he died for us. We thank you that you're patient with us. We thank you for this wonderful message, this challenging message that you've given us in your word. We pray that all of us will have open hearts to this sermon that your son gave so many years ago, and we will allow it to change who we are, and that we will be a good influence to other people around us. In everything that we do, Lord, we pray that you will be honored and that you will be glorified. Through Jesus we pray. Amen. All right, so we've been challenging everyone throughout the course of our study to make sure that as you're looking at this sermon, you are not looking at it as to what does that mean to everybody I come in contact with outside in the world. Because they're probably going to fall real short. You're probably going to have a lot of things you could say, well, they're not doing this, they're not doing that. And don't look at it as it relates to other people in the building. This sermon, I want you to make sure as we study it this time that we're all looking at how these principles Jesus gave us all these years ago, how they apply to us. How could we get better? How could we model the life that God wants us to model to the world even better than we currently are? And there was one particular time, I was meant to say this, but I did not have an opportunity to do this, or I forgot to say it. I am in no way saying that we fall way short on any of these things, okay? But I'm probably safe to say all of us could probably find something in the Sermon on the Mount that we could improve on, right? And we're never going to get there perfectly, so it's just open up your heart to the message that Jesus gives us and how amazing it was at the time and how amazing it still is today. It's life-changing if we really take these things to heart. So let's read Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 27. It says, "You have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. For it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than your whole body be cast into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you. For it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell." Of course, the command, "Thou shalt not commit adultery," is in the Old Testament, right? They heard, the people that were alive at the time actually heard God himself speak those words from heaven on the mountain. And they became so afraid of that, they asked Moses from now on to go talk to God for them. But I think we need to be very careful sometimes when we look at passages like this that we don't try to over-explain them. Have you ever noticed that sometimes when we try to, if we're really trying to explain something very simple, chances are we're going to mess it up. Does that make sense? We're just putting, if it's a simple instruction and we put way too much emphasis on it, you don't have to write 35 pages on what Jesus means by this. So if we try to overanalyze it, we might miss the main point that Jesus is making here. And I don't think we need to spend a lot of time splitting hairs too much. It's clear from this that God intends for us only to have sex with our spouse. And he intends for us only to want to have sex with our spouse. And so that is the aim. That's the objective. And if you get that core teaching that, hey, you only are supposed to have sex with the one you're married to. You're not supposed to have sex before you get married. You're not supposed to have sex with someone outside of your married relationship. And you shouldn't want to do that. And you should do everything you can to avoid not having sex with someone you're not married to and not wanting to. So if you do everything you can to not want to, and everything that you can to not commit this sin, then you're going to have the teachings of Jesus pretty much down. Now, we talked a lot, we've mentioned this, because this is going to come up a lot. You can raise your hand on this. What does Jesus mean? What is he addressing when he says, "You've heard that it was said to those of old"? What's he addressing there? The microphones are in the back. Somebody in the back, raise your hand, or else they're going to have to jog up here. What is that? I mean, he's going to say it multiple times. He's already said it once. So what does he mean? What's he addressing when he says, "You've heard that it was said to those of old"? All right, he's dealing with the Pharisees' teaching. He's not really dealing with the law itself. He's dealing with how they have put so many of their own rules and regulations on the law that they have had it all messed up. And the challenge is that all of the people that Jesus is specifically talking to, his disciples, they've sat in synagogues their entire life. They've learned from these people. And if you learn from people your entire life, does that shape your thinking? Yes. And that can be a good thing if you're sitting next to Jesus, but it can be a bad thing if people constantly are putting their own spin, their own interpretation, and telling you how you need to view Scripture. And so that's what they were used to. They had that constantly into their mind as they went to synagogue and as they learned from these people, all these technical rules that the Pharisees have put on them. So let's look at this passage and see what we can gather from this. We'll start with the first question that I asked you. Let's look at this first. So the Pharisees, what was their interpretation of the passage? What did they say it would mean? Don't commit the act, the physical act. Anything short of not committing the physical act, you're fine. Okay? That was their main mindset there. Now, we obviously know that is not true. That's not the intent of the passage. But let's just stop there for a second. They understood that adultery was sinful. The act of adultery was sinful. And it was punishable by capital punishment. So my question for you to think about for a second is, how would that teaching go over today? And what I'm trying to get you to think about is, it was tough for them to hear these words of Jesus. It was outside their realm of what was their norm. They'd always been taught that, hey, as long as you don't commit the actual adultery, you're fine. And now Jesus is challenging that to the nth degree. In our society, he would have even a harder time, right? I mean, we're several steps away from that, right? So if you were to say we should make adultery illegal, I mean, if you get caught committing adultery, it's a crime, and you should be punished by even jail time, people would think you're nuts, that you would have that kind of mindset. And I think you even go one step further and say, with Jesus' teaching of you don't even want to look at a woman to lust over her in your heart. So what the society that they lived in and the way that they presented themselves in public, especially the women, compared to today, I think this is even a bigger challenge, right? Because not only the people that we come in contact with on a regular basis aren't godly, and they're not trying to present themselves as godly. And remember, they're pretty much still in Galilee and Judea here. They're not talking about Corinth yet, right? So Jesus' message is framed with people who probably presented themselves pretty modestly, definitely in today's standards, but even in the world standard of that day. But not only that challenge, but what about all the other issues that we have with television and movies and the internet? Right? So following the command of Jesus today, the way that he wants us to, can be even more challenging because we have so many more things thrown at us than they had thrown at them. And we have men and women working together side by side a lot more now than we ever had in the past, even in the 50s when everybody was an agricultural society where everybody stayed at home. And so that adds to the equation. So this is challenging for the world, and it can be challenging for Christians as well. So we have to make sure that we don't take this and this doesn't apply to us. This isn't something that we're going to have a problem with. If we do, we're going to find ourselves in trouble. And just think about all the struggles that even the young people are going to have in their life living these commands. Emery.
So the idea you said before, a mindset of what marriage is, back then and most certainly now, it's for most of the population, it's considered as disposable rather than cherished. That when you talk about leave,
Absolutely.
Your father, mother, and cleave, and become one flesh, that's not something that you just kind of like, okay, she's here with me. It's more like we are one.
Right. And she's going to talk about that next, right? He's going to talk about divorce next. And so I think this shapes that conversation, right? If we have the right mindset about our spouse in this relationship, just the idea of wanting to stay together forever is an important point there. And I also think we need to understand this as well. The Old Testament was concerned about people having control over their heart. Right? The teaching that as long as you don't commit adultery was a fallacy, right? Because the Bible oftentimes in the Old Testament talked about how the law of the Lord is important to us and how it cleanses us. Proverbs 4:23 says, keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it springs the issue of life. It was never okay to lust over someone else, right? God never wanted that to happen. We said a lot of the teaching that he has here, he's taken us back to the creation. What he intended in the relationships at the very beginning of what people were supposed to live like who were created in his image. It's been all messed up for the couple thousand years, till Jesus came, several thousand years. Now he's saying, let's go back to what God has to say about this from the very beginning. I think that's an important part to know as well. As a matter of fact, we'll talk about this in a little bit. Proverbs chapter 5, when he talks about the immoral woman, what is one of his main warnings that he tells them to do? Stay away, right? Stay away. Because if you start going down that path, you're going to find yourself in a lot of trouble. So in Job chapter 31 and verse 1, he says, I have made a covenant with my eyes. Why then should I look on a young woman? So what they were missing a whole bunch in their interpretation of the law, and to make it easier on them, to make it something that would be easier for them to live. And they were missing the whole point. You can't read the Old Testament and say, oh yeah, God thought it was okay. It was okay to lust. You just couldn't commit adultery. God talked about heart. Dave has a question up here, guys. Dave has a question or a comment. So I think that's an important concept as well as we go through all of these, especially this one.
I'm wondering at what he says in following, the hard things to hear. If your right eye causes you to sin, take it out. If you're cut off your hand, etc. If that's just adding weight to what he's just said. Because the response would be, from someone who'd only grown up hearing, as long as you don't commit the act, that either this is too much to ask, or really, is it that serious? And he's making the point, let me draw you a parallel. If your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. If your hand causes it to sin, cut it off. He's saying that, yes, this is that important. It is that critical to your soul.
Absolutely. Yeah, he goes to the nth degree, your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. And we'll look at that in just a second, what that means to us and how that can be applied today. Well, the word lust, and like I said, sometimes if we're defining it to sort of make things easier or make it, then we're missing the whole point here. It's a strong desire for something. It can be good. You can lust over things that you're supposed to lust over, have a strong desire for good things. But it's a strong desire for something, in this context, something that you shouldn't have a strong desire for. And it really carries the idea of setting your heart upon it. Setting your heart upon a woman that's not your wife would be something that would eventually lead into trouble. Just setting your heart on in general would be wrong as well. It's used several other times in the Bible. It's talked in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 28. This is where our text, but Matthew 13:17, for verily I say to you that prophets and righteous men have desired to see those things which you see. That's the word desire. So it's a strong desire, having your mind set on certain things. It's used of the prodigal son when it said he would fain, is how the old King James Version says it, but he would desire to fill his own belly with the pods that he was feeding the pigs. So it's this strong desire for something that we have no business having a desire for. So that brings us to our first question. And that is, give examples of lust and adultery in the Old Testament and be ready to discuss the pain that it caused. Okay, so raise your hand. You should have had a chance to go over this. You probably can think of 5 or 6 off the top of your head, but hopefully you had a chance to look at it. Chloe.
Abraham and Sarah, when Abraham went to, I think it was Egypt, he lied and said that Sarah was his half-sister, and so the Pharaoh lusted after her and wanted to make her his wife, and then that caused a bunch of problems for the Pharaoh of that time.
Yeah, he did it twice. Abraham did this twice, right? And one of those recordings is in Genesis chapter 12. Genesis chapter 12, starting in verse 14. So it says, so it was when Abram came to Egypt that the Egyptians saw the woman, that she was very beautiful. The princes of Pharaoh who saw her and commended her to Pharaoh. And the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. He treated Abram well for her sake. He had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female servants, female donkeys and camels. But the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. And Pharaoh called Abram and said, "What is this that you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say, 'She is my sister'? I might have taken her as my wife. Now therefore here she is, take her and go away." So Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent her away with his wife and the land. And he does it also to Abimelech. So he does the same thing to him. And all of his family is cursed, and they can't have children. And God tells him, he's like, I didn't know. But what do we learn about these two men who weren't God's people, and what their immediate reaction was once they realized this was another man's wife? I mean, it was immediate, right? Oh, okay, this is another man's wife. I don't want her around. I don't want her in any position that she shouldn't be in. She was beautiful, and so he was somewhat thought she was attractive. And so he would have taken her as his wife until he found out she belonged to another man. And, of course, God was upset about that. And they both, why are you doing this to me? You're causing all these plagues. Joe.
Well, following up on Abimelech, he was innocent. He didn't do anything. And he's saying, God, why are you doing this? I mean, so the question says, in the pain that it caused, an innocent man was caused pain.
Yeah, very good.
Because he was tricked. The other one that I sort of had, I don't know if it would be counted as adultery, but back with Abraham and Hagar, where he should have trusted in God and not listened to his wife. And I don't know how you want to slice and dice that, but look what came out of that: Ishmael, and then, I mean, really
pain for a lot of people throughout history.
A lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, tremendous amount, because I mean, Islam followed from that general line from Ishmael.
Yeah. That was something he should not have done. They did not trust God's promises. I don't know how much lust was associated with that. It's sort of a practical business arrangement, but it was wrong, and he shouldn't have done it. And it caused him grief. It caused Sarah grief. It caused Hagar grief. She had to leave twice. Finally, the last time God said, just go ahead and leave and stay away. And so it was a big deal. That was a wrong action on his part for sure. All right, Jared has one back there.
Samson caused himself a whole lot of trouble by not controlling his lust.
Yeah, I mean, the first words we have, and this really does come up over and over and over again in these stories that I have down here. Samson, it says, I have seen a woman of the daughters of the Philistines, go get her for me. She pleases me well. And so you have this idea, he looked upon her, and he started having lustful thoughts for her, and he says, all right, I'm gonna marry her, go get her, marry her. And their parents try to beg him not to do this. Isn't there somebody among God's own people for you to marry, not this woman that you've just been attracted to by looking at her? And he was just determined to do that. Gail?
I think the most obvious one would be King David, because he premeditated and plotted and just didn't stop until he got what he wanted.
Yeah, I think David is a great example of the process, right? It starts out first, I think we can learn something. I know a lot of people have mentioned this before. You've probably heard this a lot of times, but David probably shouldn't even been there to begin with, right? He should have been out in the war with his fellow soldiers, his warriors, doing what he needed to do. And there's a huge lesson for us there. Sometimes too much idle time and not enough work time can cause problems. And so if he was focused on what he was supposed to be doing, he wouldn't have this vacuum of time which allowed him to do it. You think about the vacuum of time in the internet, how dangerous that is for people. If you're not busy, you have things you're doing, and you're just sitting there, idle time, and you start browsing the internet, you can have some serious issues there. And so I think we can learn that from David. The second obvious time when David could have stopped without being sinful is after he saw her, just to go back inside and forget about her, right? You know, he didn't have to, and this is where it sort of started turning into lust when he says, "Who is she?" Now he's starting to set his heart on her. And then when they tell him who she is and that she's married to somebody else, he doesn't put the brakes on. He doesn't tap the brakes. He doesn't say, okay, I have plenty of my own wives, and God tells him at the end, I would have given you more wives. He doesn't do any of that. He is determined to follow this through to the point of adultery. And it should have stopped way before this. How many people were hurt because of that? The entire nation. His family, David's family, his older sons, from this episode. Of course, Bathsheba had to be totally hurt by this. She loses the son that's born as a result of this, carries the son 9 months, and then the child dies. We talked about one of the unsung heroes was Ahithophel, and Ahithophel could have been her grandfather, and it might have been, and we don't know for sure, might have been the animosity he had to David even up to the end where he wanted to personally kill David, and the advice that he gave, let me go do it, I will kill him. It could have been that was something bad in his mind the entire time. Of course, her husband died. There were also other men that died in that battle, right? It wasn't just Uriah that died. I forget the number. I think it was 20-something. I forget the number of people who died. But there was a number of other people who died as a result of that. So then you have their wives, their children now. So now you start seeing all the ramifications of David just not doing what he was supposed to be doing and then not being able to turn around or turn away from her as soon as he saw her, right? Go back in the house, shut the blinds, and mind your own business. Okay? Anything else on David that you want to? All right. Brandon has something. And if you have another example, go ahead and raise your hand. You can share that one with us of adultery in the Old Testament and some things we can learn from that.
David was so consumed by his lust that even when he found out whose wife that was, Uriah, and he knew Uriah as a friend because Uriah was one of his mighty men before he became king, he still continued in lust and continued to betray his friend.
Yeah, I mean, Uriah wasn't just some guy way off on the side that he didn't have anything to do about. He knew who Uriah was, and he was helpful. He was one of David's mighty men. All right, Joe, right there.
I think to your point, I think another thing that he could have done is go in and close the curtains, or I don't know where, go somewhere else, and then go tell somebody. You might want to go over there and counsel how people bathe themselves, because if he did that, and so maybe someone else could have seen her. In other words, there's two sides of the story here too. I would have. I don't know if it went out. There it goes. I don't know if it's. I don't know where lust started, but I agree with you. It didn't start when he saw her. It started a little bit after that, where he started down the path.
At least the path to be
where
she was.
Where she was. In other words, I think that would have been. I mean, the best thing is, okay, I don't need to see that, nor does anybody else. So I'm the king. Go rearrange the program so we don't have that. Whatever, because we're not really told that.
We're not told. It could have been that David's, because he's the king, his castle was higher than everybody else's.
That's what I'm saying.
And nobody else could have seen her. He was the only one that would have had that vantage point.
But we don't know.
Yeah, and I don't think anything in Scripture gives us an indication that she was doing anything wrong.
Anything necessary.
Yeah. It could have been that he could have said, all right, all the women need to put extra walls up. And
I'm just saying,
Yeah, it could have. Absolutely. It would have, and that is a good application for us if we find something like that. It'd be okay to share that with them. All right, somebody else has a microphone.
I was thinking of Tamar and her brother and
2 Samuel 13, turn there. 2 Samuel chapter 13. Because you have lust. You have lust you have terrible counsel, right? You have all kinds of bad things here. 2 Samuel 13, and after this, Absalom, the son of David, had a lovely sister whose name was Tamar, and Amnon, the son of David, loved her. Amnon was so distressed over his sister Tamar that he became sick, for she was a virgin, and it was improper for Amnon to do anything to her. But Amnon had a friend whose name was Jonadab, and he was actually the son of David's brother. Now Jonadab was a very crafty man, and he said to him, "Why are you, the king's son, becoming thinner day by day? Will you not tell me?" Amnon said to her, "I love Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister." So let's just stop there. We probably know the rest of the story. Just from that passage, what can we learn? First of all, he was aware that it was wrong, that it was improper. And yet he did not do whatever he needed to do to turn away from that. He kept thinking about it so much so he couldn't eat, right? It was he set his mind on her. That's the definition of lust, right, that we're talking about. He desired her, that's all he could think about. It consumed his thoughts so much that he could not even eat. And then he's asked by his cousin or his friend, and the friend is told about the situation, and the friend gives terrible advice. He basically tells him to have her prepare some food, and when she does that, he tells everybody else to leave the room. I mean, this is premeditated, step by step. So adultery usually doesn't happen in a vacuum. Usually there's 5 or 6 steps ahead of time that you could have done something to stop it then, or you were walking down the wrong path before it happened. And so he lets everybody out of the room, and then what advice does she give him? This is amazing to me. She does say, "Don't do this," but she also says, "Go ask David if you can lawfully have me. He will let you have me, probably." And he didn't want to even have anything to do with that. So she's trying to get him to stop, trying to give him better counsel than his friend was giving him, and yet he was so consumed with her and thinking about her, not eating because of her, he went ahead with this. And what was the result after that? He just loved her and wanted to take her and be part of he hated her, right? It says the love which he loved her, the hatred that he had for her after that was greater than the love he felt for her, the passion he felt for her before he committed the sin. And isn't there a huge lesson there as well? Sin is ugly. And it might appear that you're going to avoid some consequences, and you might think this person, we're in love, or whatever the case may be, but unlawful relationships like this most of the time end terribly, where nobody's happy, everybody's hurt. And thinking about that would be very important. Chloe?
There was another moment in the story, like he's like, "That's my brother's sister." So he's already like distancing himself familiar-wise or family-wise to be like, she's not my sister, she's my brother's sister. So right. He was trying to rationalize a little bit.
Yeah, she was his half-sister. She was Absalom's full sister. And yeah, you're doing some rationalizing, but you're also scared to death of it, The fact that she was Absalom's sister should have been enough, He should have known better than that. You had Judah. We talked about Judah a long time ago, right? Judah has not fulfilled God's plan by giving his youngest son to his daughter-in-law who had both of his other sons had died, right? And she dressed up as a harlot as he was going down to shear some sheep, and he didn't know it was his daughter-in-law, and his wife was dead. And that's sort of after the time of mourning his own wife's death, he decided to stop in at the harlot, with the harlot, the local harlot. It wasn't his town, and he gave him a pledge, and he ended up, having a child by his daughter-in-law. It was all started with lust and wanting to have something that he should have had no right having. She's a prostitute. He had no right going into her. Yes, sir.
sorry, I didn't know you were ready. The cities of Sodom and Gomorrah and the mob that came outside of Lot's house comes to mind. We often forget they almost seem to have a lust for lust itself. They wanted. They didn't want someone. They wanted depravity itself. Because Lot says, "Please, here, I've got this equally terrible option, but at least it feels a little easier on my conscience, I guess, or something." And they say, we forget. They say, "You just wait. After we deal with them, we're coming back for you, and we're going to do even worse to you." They weren't even interested in gratification. They were literally, I don't have any better way to put it than lusting for depravity itself. It's to the extent that Sodom is now a root word in and of itself to this very day.
Yeah. So it was almost like they just wanted. Sometimes people want the forbidden, and the more forbidden it is, the more they long for it. And so you have to be very careful by having that mindset. There's several others in here as well. You have the the one shining example was Joseph, right? I'm not saying it's the only one, but boy, Potiphar's wife was the one that was lusting, right? Day by day. And he made firm commitment. I am not going to sin against my master, who has put me in charge of everything, and I'm not going to sin against God. So there was no lust there. And she was probably an attractive woman, but there was no lust on his part. He knew that was wrong, and so he wasn't even going to go down to the concept or the thought process of even pretending it could be okay. And he told her that it was not okay. And I think that is a good lesson for us as well. So there are other examples that we don't have a chance to get to, but let's go to the next one. And this is sort of what Dave was talking about. What length did Jesus say we should go to prevent ourselves from sinning? Pluck out your right eye. What are some practical things we could fit in this category? How far are you willing to go not to sin? Especially in light of this particular temptation. Chloe?
If you have a problem with like dating sites or seeing people like online or something like that, you can, remove that temptation by getting rid of your laptop, getting rid of whatever you're able to go online with.
Yeah, so most people instantly would say, I can't live without it. I can't live without my computer. I can't live without my phone. I can't live without this. It's just part of my life. I have to have it. I have to have it for work. I have to have it for this. There's ways to make it so you can't be on sites that you're not supposed to be on. And if destroying it was the only option, and I put down here, would you get another job? I mean, would you just quit your job and say, I can't work here because of the people who are here and the lustful environment that it puts me in? Would you just say, I can't. I have to quit? You may not want to tell your boss why you're quitting, but is that a decision that you are willing to make? Mm-hmm. Debbie?
Well, I was going to say that, either make sure you are only around, you're on your internet when other people are around, or you put filters on it. I mean, there are things that can be done. Yeah. The other thing would be like, just where you go and what you see, we don't frequent the beach. We don't frequent places that are, where people are scantily clad and things like that, so that and stay busy. I don't know about anybody else, but I'm never bored. So there's just not a lot of time, but if there's idle hands is what the devil's playground. Mm-hmm. So I think all of us have plenty to do. Being kingdom citizens, that we need to be either busy working or tending to things that we need to do and not have that kind of idle time. Yeah,
very good. We'd want to be not only be willing to quit our job, be willing to move if you had to. If I had to move out of the neighborhood or I had to move somewhere else. I mean, if those are small things compared to cutting your hand off and plucking your eye out, right? Those are small things. And so we need to have the attitude that we would be willing to do whatever we need to do to get out of the environment that makes me want to even be tempted to have a relationship with someone I'm not supposed to have. Dave?
I just want to make sure that we understood that we've talked a lot about the earthly consequences and earthly relationships and what happens when there's lust involved and what, between this lateral relationships. But Jesus turns immediately from saying that to the relationship between us and God and eternal consequences. Yes, there are going to be consequences when we sin in this life, but the sin ultimately is against God, and the consequences ultimately are those of our soul as we stand before God. And it's more than just how inconvenient it can be for us or embarrassing.
Yeah. The whole text is kingdom citizenship, right? And if you have that kind of attitude, cavalier attitude towards not only the act itself, but the lust and the things that lead up to the act, you're not going to be a kingdom citizen. And this is part of your righteousness exceeding the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. And then what practical things can we do to protect ourselves from lust? I think Debbie pointed out some of those. Just stay away from tempting environments, tempting people, tempting things like movies, television shows, internet. I think we also need to avoid casual relationships with people of the opposite gender. We don't want to have totally build huge brick walls around people, but there comes a time where you say, you know what, I have to watch myself. I cannot have relationships where I get too friendly with someone who is of the opposite gender, and you're just going to have to monitor that. And I think that's a very important thing that we do. And you need to be very careful about any kind of physical contact with someone of the opposite gender, even hugs or anything of that nature. You're very, very careful what you're doing in that way. And I have down here, be accountable, get tracked if you need to, and then stay busy. Stay busy and stay away from things that are going to give you too much extra time. All right, I have questions for next time.